Hey guys, welcome back to another video tutorial. In today's video I'm gonna show you what if MESTO and VLUARR made a collab, so let's stop beating around the bush and go ahead with the preview. So I'm gonna start explaining how I made this vocal shop. To make this vocal shop, I basically use slide sex, as you can see, and I pick up a vocal from a Unison sample pack, and this is how the original sounds like. What I did here was basically play around with the pitch in order for the vocal to get shape, and it would sound like this. Well, as you can notice, it's an octave lower, and that's why I decided to render it, and then I raise an octave. And the process that I used in this vocal was some distortion, EQ as well, EQ again, wider, reverb, and Graillon too. I also used this vocal in order to give more ambience to the breakdown. The process in this vocal is really similar. Some distortion, EQ as well, wider, some reverb as well, EQ again, and Graillon too. And in this part I took all the way up. I also used this spot. I added this session automation clip, and I also used this EQ automation clip cutting some low frequencies. The process on the pad, it's not a big deal. I basically use some distortion, an EQ as well, and session. I also use this dark bass. And for this bass, I basically use the same automation clips that I use in the pad. And let's talk about the process that I use in this bass. I use some distortion, an EQ as well, cutting some high frequencies, wider as well, session, and EQ again. I also added this tremolo ambience. And I use this session automation clip. And in this part I use a reverb automation clip, and this is the process that I use in tremolo ambience, some distortion, EQ, reverb, and session. I also use this kick and some hi-hats as well, and together it would sound like this. It's a basic rhythm. Well, and in this second part of the breakdown I added this choir. I didn't use any automation clip for this choir, but let's get into the process. What I used in this choir was some distortion, an EQ as well, wider, and session. And in this second part of the breakdown I also added this, ambient sound. And I added this session automation clip, and in this part I added a reverb automation clip. And I added some claps for this second part of the breakdown. Now let's go through the build-up. For the build-up, the vocal chop changed. So let's take a listen how this sounds like.
Yeah.
And yes, I also use SliceX for this one. Well, for the build-up, there's nothing interesting except for the automation clips for the session that are disabled. And in this part of the build-up, the automation clips for the EQ start to cutting some low frequencies. In the middle of the build-up, I added some snares, some claps as well. And if you talk about the effects sections, I added some risers, down filters, up filters as well, so they sound like this. Now let's go through the drop. For the drop, I basically use 3 layers of plugs. The first layer sounds like this. The second layer sounds like this. And the last one would sound like this. If you ask me, I would say that this layer is the main layer. And well, I use the same couple of automation clips for all of them. A reverb automation clip, a session automation clip, and a volume automation clip. For the first layer, I use some distortion, an EQ as well, wider, reverb, session, and session again. For the second layer is the same process, so I don't have to explain again. And for the last layer, the process is kind of different. I use some distortion, EQ as well, more distortion, an EQ, another EQ, wider, and reverb, session, and session again. Well, I also use this lid. And this is the process that I use for it. Some distortion, some EQ, more EQ as well, wider, and session. I also use some chords. As you can see, for the chords I only use a volume automation clip as well, and this is the process. Some distortion, an EQ as well, wider, and session. Well, as you can see, I also use a mid bass, and they are 2 layers and they sound like this. I only use a volume automation for those 2, and this is the process that I use for them. For some distortion, an EQ, and session. That's the process for the first layer. Now for the second layer was almost the same. Some distortion, an EQ as well, but in this second layer I added wider, and session as well. This is another mid bass that I added. The process that I used for this was some distortion, an EQ, cutting some low frequencies, but at the same time is cutting some high frequencies, as you can see. I also use wider and session. For the sub bass, what I used was basically an 808. And this is the process that I used for it, was some distortion, an EQ, and session. Really basic, honestly. Now let's take a look to the drums and effects section, and they sound like this. As you can see, I added a kick, some claps. I also added this weird sample, some toms as well. I also added these little percussion samples. I also added some hi-hats. Some reverse effects. I also use some bass shots. And I also use some brushes. In the middle I also use this vocal. And finally I use this crowd sample. Well guys, that's all. Let's take a listen how the final result sounds like, and it would sound like this. Well guys, I hope you liked this video. Remember that if you have a suggestion for me, you can leave a comment down below or hit me up on Instagram. So let's call it a day and see you in the next video.